What's up? This is your boy Uber Hikari, aka the Nerd Nigga, here to bring you another video with no frills, just the analysis. And today I'm going to be bringing you the Season 5, Episode 5 review of Breaking Bad entitled Dead Freight. And before I begin, let me just ask this. Everybody who thinks that Walter White will be redeemed at the end of the 5th season, stand on your head. If you believe that, stand on your head. Who could believe this now? And not only that, but it's very interesting to me because it seems like people are still that there are still some people who are rooting for Walter White. I don't see how you can either believe that he's going to be redeemed at the end of the 5th season or still be actively rooting for this guy. I just don't see it. I just don't see it. Very quick thoughts on this episode overall. This won't, I hope that doesn't give you the impression that this video will be very quick. Probably won't be. But just a very quick impression of this episode overall. It was more of a plot-driven episode than a character-driven episode. It was more focused on how Walter could get his business back on track after the sort of hiccup in methylamine. So this episode certainly wasn't a bad episode, but it was just more bare bones, stick to the plot progression episode. And again, the pacing was pretty good. Yeah. So yeah, overall this episode was pretty good. But a couple of things that I want to talk about before I get into my overall summary and analysis of this episode. First, I want to talk about the prologue of the first episode. When I first watched that, I didn't know what the hell was going on. And I didn't really realize that it was a sort of non-linear setup to the 5th season until like a couple of days ago. And it's remarkable how much stuff you miss. Well, at least for me as a reviewer, because 90% of the stuff I talk about in my episode reviews, I never think of unless I know I'm going to review something. So the beginning of that first episode, it just totally, I don't know, my mind just totally blanked out. So now I understand that that's a lot of foreshadowing, and there has to be a time skip, because in the last episode Walter just turned 51, but in the beginning of the first episode apparently he was turning 52. So we know that there's going to be a 1 year, that this 5th season is going to encompass 1 year in Walter White's life. And I can't for the life of me think how they'll get through an entire year in the remaining, what is it? I don't know, it's going to be 16 episodes minus 5, so 11 episodes. So my suspicion is that there will be a time skip between the first part of the 5th season and the second part of the 5th season. And in that prologue, it looked like he was on the run from somebody, perhaps Mike, maybe Jesse, maybe even the police. So the foreshadowing of that initial episode of the 5th season is very foreboding, in that it doesn't look like there's going to be the redemption that everybody expects or would want there to be for Walter White. So it doesn't look good for him. The second thing I want to address before I get into a summary and analysis of this episode is the characterization of Skyler White. I have to address this. I can't put it off anymore, because I've been watching other people's episode reviews and have been reading through some of the comment section of those videos, and apparently Skyler White is still the bitch character. And I just don't understand this. I will say, however, that there were some parts throughout, I believe it was either the third season. I think it was either the third. Yeah, I think it was the third season where I didn't like her either. Or was it the fourth season? But in any event, there were some points where I didn't like her, especially when she was cheating on Walter with Ted Beneke and was attempting to hurt Walter by trying to keep the children away from him. So yeah, she definitely qualified for the bitch role. But now I can't explain the avid dislike for Skyler White's character in any other way except gender bias. And I don't want to be that guy who's oh, I'm a feminist and let's talk about feminists. Although I am a feminist, but I don't I don't want to sort of bring that feminist ideology into this, because it really is an irrational dislike of Skylar White's character, given her situation as a character now. If we were still back in season 4, I would understand it. But now, she's a completely sympathetic character. I mean, and what's very, very interesting about female characters and the bitch role is that once a woman has been cast as the bitch, it's very hard for them to break out of that role. And this can definitely be seen in a character like Lori from The Walking Dead. She's a bitch, and I don't think there's ever going to be the possibility of her getting out of that bitch role. But let's look at what Walter White has done. If people are going to say, I don't like Skylar White, she's a bitch, let's look at what Walter White has done in comparison to what Skylar White has done. Okay, so Skylar's cheated on him and has attempted to keep him away from the children, not always without good reason. All right, those are two of the main things that Skylar White has done. What has Walter White done? Well, let's see. He attempted to rape her once. He's killed people, including setting off a pipe bomb inside of a hospital, running over people with his car, shooting, who was that, Gail, getting Jesse to shoot Gail to death. He's manipulated his family. He's turned them into objects to magnify his own vanity. He's manipulated the family against Skylar. Even Walt Jr. has at one point referred to her as a bitch. He has poisoned the child and has throughout the towards the end of the 4th season and the beginning of this season, he's transformed himself into something of a narcissistic despot. So why do people still root for Walter White? And why do people still see Skylar White as the bitch character? Very awkward to me. Very, very awkward to me. And that's the reason why I say I can't explain this avid dislike of Skylar in any other terms except gender bias. It has to be gender bias because Walter has done things that are far more worse than what Skylar White has done, and yet people root for him and still see Skylar as the bitch. And in my eyes, as far as I'm concerned, especially given what we've seen at the end of this episode, I don't see how Walter White can be redeemed. I just don't see it. And from where I stand, you can't do bad things like poison children, set off pipe bombs in hospitals, kill innocent people. You can't do those types of bad things and expect to get redeemed as a character in the final 11 episodes of the series. And if that happens, I'm calling bullshit. I'm definitely calling bullshit. So, but let's still talk about Skylar White just a little bit more. Promise I won't take up too much of your time with this, but let's look at the arc of her character development. Skylar first started off as a likable character, then she became a bitch, but now it seems like she's completely sympathetic. I mean, look at her position now. Walt has manipulated her family and turned them against her. Like I said, Walt Jr. has even referred to her on an occasion as a bitch. Hank and Marie think that she's being cruel to Walter, especially after the sob story that he just gave Hank in this episode about how Skylar doesn't love him and she's being cruel to him and he's a bad father and all this other nonsense. And now Skylar has become complicit in Walt's criminal activity merely as a means of protecting her children. Because before, she was a willing participant. But now that she understands the considerable amount of danger that her family is in as a result of Walter being involved in this criminal activity, now she set up an arrangement with Walter. In this episode, she says, listen, I'm going to be whatever kind of partner you want me to be. Just keep the children out of it. So that's the type of position Skylar White is now in. And in my eyes, again, she's a completely sympathetic character. So now let's get to my summary and analysis of this episode specifically. So this episode basically deals with the methylamine problem. As you may remember the last episode, there was a tracking device on one of the barrels and there was some sort of allusion to the fact that Lydia may have planted it there to sort of psych out Walter and Mike and Jesse. So the crew basically has to figure out what's going on with these tracking devices, or with this tracking device in particular. So Walter so there's a scene with at the beginning of this episode with Walter and Hank. So Walter has come to visit Hank at his office. So Walter shows up at the office, and he again is going through this pity party. He wants everybody to feel sorry for him, and he wants to use that as a way to manipulate their emotions and their feelings, particularly against Skyler. So he starts talking about how Skyler doesn't love him. She thinks he's a bad father. And there's a point in this scene where Hank walks out of the office, and then Walter proceeds to tap his phone and bug his office. And we see that what's really going on is that Walter does this so that he can find out what's happening with these tracking devices. So after he's bugged Hank's office and tapped his phone, he leaves, and then he meets up with Lydia, Mike, and Jesse, and they have Lydia under threat of death. They have Lydia call Hank and inquire about the tracking devices, and apparently they were planted by the authorities, just not from. Hank works with the DEA, but somebody else planted those tracking devices, so they were able to listen in on Hank's on the call and figure out what was going on with the tracking devices. But one thing I was thinking about when Walter was going through this whole pity party thing with Hank at the office about the fact that Skylar doesn't love him and she thinks he's a bad father, I was wondering, is when was the last time we saw Walter have a genuine emotion? I mean, when was the last time we saw him have a genuine emotion where he wasn't using his emotion or some sort of psychological tactic to manipulate and outcalculate somebody? When was the last time? I mean, and when was the last time he ever showed genuine love or altruism? And that's something I just started thinking about as I watched him manipulate Hank in the office scene. And this is why I said a couple of episode reviews ago that he's really showing more and more sociopathic tendencies. I mean, when you talk about a psychopath is a person who's given over to their violent impulses, who has uncontrollable violent impulses so they can't help themselves. Sociopaths, on the other hand, tend to be very calculating, very manipulative, and that's precisely the kind of character that Walter White has become. He can simulate human emotion. He can make it seem as if he has genuine human emotion, when in reality, every time we see Walter White, he's using emotion or psychology as a way to either manipulate somebody or outcalculate them. And I just can't remember a time when he showed genuine emotion and genuine remorse or altruism towards another human being. I just can't think of it. Again, I can't remember the last time Walter White had shown real, intimate, empathetic human relationships between himself and another person. I I just can't remember. So in my eyes, he's becoming just more and more sociopathic. But in any event, getting back to the methylamine problem and the methylamine heist, as it turns out, they realize that through Lydia's inquiry to Hank, they find out that all the barrels going to Madrigal, I think is where Lydia works, have been tagged. So now they definitely need a new source of methylamine so that they can continue cooking. And Lydia tells them about a train that is apparently carrying 24,000 gallons of methylamine. So Hank, Jesse, and Mike put together a plan to basically rip off this train for about 1,000 gallons out of that 24,000 gallons of methylamine. And one of the problems that they have, and this is very, very good foreshadowing on the part of the writers, and produces an extraordinary irony at the end of the episode. The problem was that what Mike pointed out is that there are two types of heists. The one where you get caught, or the second is where you kill the people so that there are no witnesses who can identify you. So they have this seemingly moral dilemma about how exactly to go about ripping off the train without having to kill the conductor and the engineer who are stationed on the train that's carrying the methylamine. So they come up with this idea to drive a truck out on the train tracks, which stops the train. And this is a very truncated version of what actually happens, but this is basically the gist of what happens. So they drive a truck out into the train tracks and have a guy pretend to have engine trouble. And while they're trying to figure out how to get the car off the track, um, Jesse and somebody else who they've added to the crew are going to drain 1,000 gallons of the methylamine out of the train and replace it with water, because methylamine is an aqueous solution. For those of you who do not remember your high school chemistry, an aqueous solution is one that is able to be dissolved in water. So they do this to replace the 1,000 gallons that they've taken away, so that it doesn't raise suspicion, so that there isn't a discrepancy between what the train actually has and what it's supposed to have. So the heist, they're able to pull this heist off. Very suspenseful scene, and it was very successful. So they realized, yay, we pulled it off. We've got 1,000 gallons of methylamine. We didn't have to kill anybody. And in the closing scene of the episode, and this is where I mentioned the extraordinary irony that's produced by the foreshadowing at at the beginning of this episode. You have a kid who happens to ride up on his bicycle. I don't know if it's like, it's one of those little motorcycle moped type things that you have for children. It's not a real motorcycle, but it's, one of those little motorcycles. And he looks at what they've just done. And the guy who Walter and Jesse and Mike have recruited into the crew to help them pull off this heist immediately pulls out a gun and shoots the kid dead. Now, this is ironic, not because of the fact that they had to come up with this complicated plan just to avoid killing the train conductor and the engineer on the train, but it's also extremely ironic given the fact that at one point Walter White was against Gus because he had dealers who were recruiting children to deal drugs for him. Remember this? Ah, yes, I think a lot of people remember. In fact, these were the drug dealers that Walter had to run over with his car to save Jesse from being killed. Remember that? Yeah. So remember how there was this moral between Jesse and Walter, there was this moral objection to Gus working with people who would use kids to sell drugs? And now we're in this ironic situation where Walter White is working with a person who would not just recruit a child to sell drugs for him, but who would shoot a child dead. No hesitation, no apprehension, no words, nothing. Just shoot the child dead. That's a hell of a turnaround. And at this point, again, if you're the type of person who would work with another human being who would kill children, I mean, forget the fact that Walter White poisoned a child and almost killed him. Forget that fact. If you would work with another human being who would kill a child in cold blood, an innocent child in cold blood, then the possibility for your redemption is approaching zero, 0% very, very rapidly. Very, very rapidly. And it's an extraordinary irony within this episode and even across the entire series. And it also gives us some very, very visceral insight into the type of person that Walter White has become. And at this point, again, I don't see how anybody can continue to root for Walter White or think that there's any possibility that he will be redeemed in the remaining 11 episodes of this 5th and final season of Breaking Bad. So this was your boy Uber Hikari, aka the Nerd Nigga. Just brought you another video with no frills, just the analysis. Peace and have a blessed day.